ground is dry, packed earth, summer dust, the kind that sticks to your knees when you fall, and to your palms when you push yourself back up. A child is lying face down in that dust, arms stretched wide, completely still. The village has gone quiet, not the quiet of afternoon naps or the hush of the Sabbath. Something different, something that comes when people see something they don't have words for yet, and so they stop making any sound at all. No cartwheels, no women at the well, no children calling across the narrow street. And then, out of that silence, a voice. Zeno. A pause. The kind of pause that lasts long enough for you to hold your breath. Zeno. The name was called twice. Not once, the way you call someone who might just be around the corner. Twice. The way you call someone who has gone much further away than the next room. The way you call someone back across a distance that should be impossible to cross. And by the time that voice finished speaking the second time, the boy in the dust was standing up. He was answering, "That scene is not in your Bible. It is not in Matthew, not in Mark, not in Luke, not in John. You will not find it in any Sunday school curriculum, in any catechism, in any official document produced by any denomination of Christianity in the last 2,000 years. But it exists. It was written down. It was copied by hand across multiple languages and multiple centuries. It was illustrated by monks who worked inside the institutions of the medieval church. And it was disturbing enough to one of the most respected bishops of early Christianity that he called it out by name, publicly in a major theological work, and said, "Do not treat this as authoritative." And it survived anyway. There are 4 layers to this story, and the last one is the one that nobody ever asked you to think about, because the layer itself explains why they didn't. Before we go down, if this kind of history is what you're here for, subscribe before we get deeper. The YouTube algorithm only brings you the next video if you signal you want more of this, and the next layers are where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. Subscribe and stay with me. Everyone knows that the childhood of Jesus is a blank page. You were told this, in one way or another, by every institution that shaped your understanding of Christian history. The Christmas story ends around age 2, or maybe 12, depending on which gospel you're reading. Then, the next scene is the River Jordan, Jesus as a grown man, stepping into the water to be baptized by John, nearly 3 decades of his life, the years when a person grows from a child into whoever they are going to be. And the 4 canonical gospels give you almost nothing. The assumption that most people carry away from this, silently, without ever quite saying it aloud, is, the blank page means there was nothing to write. The silence means silence was the truth. That is layer 1. And it is not completely wrong. The canonical gospels were not suppressing stories they knew about. They were writing from within a tradition that had made specific choices about what constituted reliable testimony. The blank childhood was, within the canonical framework, the honest blank. But that is not the same thing as saying the blank page was empty everywhere. It was not. I taught history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana, for 12 years. 12 years of lesson plans, unit reviews, state standards, diocesan curriculum guides, textbooks that had been vetted and approved by the archdiocese. 12 years of standing in front of teenagers and explaining the history of early Christianity, the Roman context, the Jewish context, the spread of the early church, the councils, the canon. And in those 12 years, not once, not one time, in any approved material I was ever handed, was there any mention that complete written gospels about the childhood of Jesus existed. Whole texts circulating in the early Christian world telling stories that the 4 canonical gospels had left out. Stories with named characters, named locations, named incidents. The curriculum went Manger, Egypt, Nazareth, blank, River Jordan, and called that the full picture. It wasn't. There is a text. Scholars call it the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And before anything else, let's be precise. This is not the same document as the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that was found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1947. Different text, different tradition, different theological purposes entirely. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is specifically a narrative account of the childhood of Jesus, covering approximately age 5 through age 12, and its purpose is very clear: to fill in the biographical gap that the canonical Gospels left open. It began circulating in the 2nd century AD. Tony Burke, a scholar who spent years producing a critical edition of this text, studying the Syriac manuscript tradition in detail, published in 2017, situates this document within a broader genre of ancient biographical writing that we might call pious fiction. This was a common form in the ancient world. Followers of a great figure writing stories that gave texture and humanity to the gaps in the historical record. It was not deception. It was devotion taking a literary form. The writers of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas were asking a genuine theological question. If this man was divine from the beginning of his life, not just from his baptism or his ministry, then what did that divinity actually look like when it was housed in a 5-year-old body? What does divine power do when the person wielding it has not yet learned fully what power is for? The answer they gave is not the one you were prepared for. In the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the young Jesus strikes a child dead for running into him in the street. Not a mortal blow in the ordinary sense. The text describes the child simply falling and dying after Jesus says words over him. Later, when the parents and neighbors complain and go to Joseph about what his son has done, Jesus blinds them. Not figuratively. The text says he blinded those who were criticizing him. He kills another boy later in the text as well, for reasons the text barely pauses to explain. His father, Joseph, watching these incidents accumulate, takes the child by the ear in one scene and demands an explanation. And Jesus responds to him with a look that the text describes as causing Joseph to wither. This portrait of a child whose divine power is uncontained, unorganized, potentially lethal to anyone who crosses him. This is the portrait that 2nd century Christians wrote down and copied and circulated. And then, at a specific moment in the text, something happens that reframes everything that came before it. Wait, because this is where the story changes. The boy who fell from the roof was named Zeno. That name is not random. Scholars who study this text carefully have noticed something in the choice. Zeno of Elea was a Greek philosopher famous for his paradoxes about motion, the most well-known being that an arrow in flight is, at any given instant, stationary, and therefore motion itself is a philosophical impossibility. Zeno of Elea spent his intellectual life arguing about the impossibility of things arriving. And the Zeno in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is a boy who falls, stops, and is made to rise again. A boy whose movement between death and life is precisely what the story is about. Some scholars who have studied the text read the name as deliberate literary play, a character whose very name points toward the paradox of arrival and non-arrival, named after the philosopher who argued that nothing ever truly arrives at its destination. Whether the author intended that connection is a question nobody can answer definitively. But the coincidence, if it is a coincidence, is a striking one. And it suggests that whoever wrote this text was working with more intellectual sophistication than the label pious fiction might imply. The account of what happened to Zeno is preserved in the Greek recension of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the standard version of the text as it has been transmitted. The academic database e-Clavis, maintained by the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, has documented the manuscript evidence for this episode carefully and confirmed that the Zeno account is part of the core text, not a marginal addition or a later invention. This is not a fragment recovered from a single obscure copy. This is central. Here is what happened, in the order the text tells it. Zeno was playing on the roof of a house. Flat roofs, common in that part of the world, used as outdoor space in the evenings and mornings. He was playing. He fell. He died. When the other children nearby saw Zeno fall, they ran, and the text says that some of them went to find Jesus, who had been somewhere near the house when it happened. The parents of Zeno came out. They found their son on the ground, and they began to say that Jesus had been there, that Jesus had pushed Zeno off the roof. Now we are at the layer, the one that changes everything. Jesus walked to the edge of the roof. He did not go down to where Zeno lay. He stood at the edge, the same edge, presumably, from which Zeno had fallen, and he called down. Zeno. A pause. Long enough for the word to settle. Zeno. And then the boy who had just died got up. He was standing in the dust, and Jesus looked down at him from the roof and asked, "Did I push you?" And the boy who had just been brought back from death looked up and said, "No, Lord." That was the miracle. Read that sequence again. Do not let the extraordinary fact of a resurrection move past you too quickly and absorb the reason for it. Jesus did not raise Zeno from the dead because he loved Zeno. He raised Zeno because he needed Zeno to testify. The accusation had been made. You pushed him. And the most direct way to respond to that accusation was to produce the one person whose testimony would be definitive. Zeno himself. The resurrection of Zeno was an act of self-defense. This is the moment in the text that makes people stop and read it again. That makes people who grew up in churches feel something they cannot quite name. That makes scholars who study this text professionally write careful footnotes about what exactly the author intended and whether the theological implications were fully considered. Here is the discomfort, the most extraordinary power a human being could be believed to possess. The power to undo death, to call a name across whatever distance separates the living from the dead, was used in this story to clear an accusation. Not for Zeno's sake, for Jesus' sake. And the early Christians who wrote this down were not, by any serious scholarly reading of the evidence, trying to make Jesus look bad. They were devoted to him. Deeply, genuinely devoted. They were trying to answer the question of what it looked like for a divine person to inhabit a child's body and a child's situation. And one honest answer to that question is, it looked like a child who had more power than wisdom, who reacted, who used what he had available for reasons that were not always purely selfless. That portrait of Jesus, the one still learning what to do with what he was, that portrait did not make it into the canon. And here is the third layer, the one that nobody tells you, and the one that explains why the first two got buried. Irenaeus of Lyon was not a peripheral figure. He was the Bishop of Lyon in what is now southern France, writing around 180 AD. He produced a massive theological work called Against Heresies, in Latin Adversus Heresies, in which he systematically identified and critiqued forms of Christianity that he considered to be deviating from the tradition he received. It is one of the most important theological documents of the 2nd century. His voice carried. And Irenaeus, in that work, identified material from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas by name, and said clearly, "This is not part of how we received the story of Jesus. This is being used by groups whose theology the mainstream church was already beginning to reject. It is apocryphal." That designation, apocryphal, meaning set aside, not part of the authoritative account, came within decades of the text's first circulation. Not centuries later. Not after some long institutional debate. Within a generation of the text being written and shared, a major theological voice said, "This is not the canon. and the text kept circulating anyway. A monk in Milan in the 14th century, 1200 years after Irenaeus wrote his warning, copied and illustrated scenes from the tradition that absorbed this material. He worked in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, or what would become it, on a manuscript catalogued today as L58 Sup, a document called the Evangelica Historia. It is an illustrated life of Christ that draws from canonical Gospels and from apocryphal traditions, including the Pseudo-Matthew, the Latin text that incorporated childhood miracles from the tradition of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The 19th century scholar Antonio Maria Seriani, then the chief librarian of the Ambrosiana, edited this manuscript in facsimile. It is documented. It is accessible to scholars. A monk, inside a Catholic institution, copying and illustrating scenes from a tradition that a 2nd century bishop had called apocryphal over 1,000 years earlier. Not secretly, not as an act of rebellion, as a devotional act. Think about what that means in concrete terms. The Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan was not a repository of forbidden or hidden texts. It was, and is, one of the great Catholic libraries of Europe, a place of institutional preservation, of careful scholarship, of religious devotion expressed through the care of manuscripts. The monk who worked on the Evangelica Historia was not sneaking apocryphal material past his superiors. He was producing a life of Christ that included these scenes because the tradition that carried them had not been destroyed. It had been preserved alongside the canonical tradition in a different category. Not the authoritative gospel, but the devotional supplement, the imaginative filling in of what the 4 Gospels left open. That is a very specific institutional relationship with a text, not suppression, not endorsement. Something more complicated, a tolerance that extended across 12 centuries. The cover-up narrative does not fit the facts. The Church did not suppress this portrait. They categorized it, placed it outside the authoritative canon, and then watched it survive across a millennium of manuscript culture, being copied and recopied and adapted and illustrated by people who found it worth preserving even without the authority of the canon behind it. And here is what that fact forces you to ask, if you are willing to sit with it. If the Church had wanted this portrait of Jesus, the one still learning what to do with his power, the one raising the dead to clear his name, if they had wanted it gone, they had centuries and institutions and authority and scriptoria to make it gone. The text we are talking about was identified as non-canonical in 180 AD. The Biblioteca Ambrosiana manuscript was copied in the 14th century. That is 1,200 years during which the Church had every structural resource to ensure this text disappeared. It didn't disappear, which means the survival was not accidental. It was a decision, or a series of decisions, made by individual monks and scribes and translators across centuries, to preserve a portrait of Jesus that the official account had set aside. Not because those individuals were rebels, because the portrait answered something that the official account did not. The human need to understand the years that the canon left blank did not disappear just because the canon said, "We cannot authorize those stories." The need kept producing copies. The need kept producing illustrations. The need kept producing readers. It didn't disappear, which means the survival of this portrait was, at minimum, tolerated, and probably something more than that. Probably, in some quiet institutional corners, the people who copied and illustrated this material understood that the portrait it presented, the divine child who was still arriving, still becoming, still using power for reasons that mixed purity with need. That portrait was answering a question that the canonical Gospels never quite addressed. What happens in the years the canon left blank? The official answer, the canonical answer was, we don't know, and we don't need to know. What matters is what happened at the Jordan, and what happened at Golgotha, and what happened on the 3rd day. The apocryphal answer was, here is what we imagined. Here is the portrait that devotion produced when it tried to fill in the silence. And here is the third layer, stated plainly. The reason those years were left blank in the canon was not accident or ignorance. It was a choice about what kind of Jesus could anchor a theology. A theology needs its central figure to have arrived, to be complete, to act from purpose and love and the fullness of what he was. A theology that anchors itself to a Jesus who is still becoming, who uses the power to raise the dead for his own vindication. That theology asks its followers to hold much more complicated questions than a theology of arrival requires. The canon chose arrival. The Apocrypha chose becoming. And the Church made the canonical choice official, while the apocryphal choice traveled down the centuries in manuscripts and illustrations and stories that people kept telling even when the Church had said, "This is not the authorized account." Now go back to the beginning. Back to that packed earth, that summer dust, that silence. Remember the blank page. Remember the assumption that said, if it wasn't in the Gospels, it must not have existed. Remember how clean and tidy that felt. The manger, then 30 years of silence, then the Jordan. You know now that the silence was populated, that the 2nd century was full of Christians writing stories about the boy Jesus with enough vivid specificity to name a particular child. Name his accident. Name the way his name was called twice before he answered. You know that one of the most prominent bishops of that century flagged this material and called it non-canonical within decades of its composition. You know that a monk in medieval Milan found it worth illustrating anyway. The blank page was a decision, made by specific people, for specific theological reasons, with specific consequences. And one of those consequences was that you and I grew up without ever having to ask the question that the Zeno story forces you to ask. Can divine power be self-interested? Not evil. Not malicious. Just. Is it possible for the most extraordinary power in the universe to be used in a moment of pressure for a reason that is not completely selfless? Can a being who is becoming divine, not a being who has fully arrived, but a being in the process of becoming, can that being make a choice that serves its own needs as much as anyone else's? The Infancy Gospel of Thomas says yes. And then it says, and then he kept growing. And by the time he was 12, he was in the temple, talking to the teachers, beginning to understand what he was. The arc is developmental, not damning. The Zeno moment is not the last word. It is part of a portrait of becoming, but it is a portrait that demands something from the person looking at it. It demands that you hold the complexity of a figure who is divine and still arriving at the full weight of what that means. The canon decided you weren't being asked to hold that. The Spinoza Forever Library. Linked in the description and in the first pinned comment is 5 volumes of the kind of reading that lives at the edges of the received account. Not philosophy textbooks, not academic writing. Reading that takes you to the borders of what you were told and shows you the landscape on the other side. This video is one border. The library is a collection of them. If that is the kind of reading you want access to, the link is there. This is what it means for you. If you grew up in any tradition that handed you a Jesus, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, liberal mainline, completely lapsed, never churched, you were handed a selected Jesus. Every tradition, including the most academically rigorous ones, makes choices about which portraits to preserve, which questions to foreground, which years to leave blank. Those choices are not conspiracies. They are theological positions. Decisions about what a community can carry and what it needs its central figure to be. The canon chose the Jesus who arrived, who acted from love, whose miracles were always for others. Even as a 12-year-old in the temple, that Jesus already sounds like someone who knows what he is. The Apocrypha chose the Jesus who was getting there, who had the power before he fully had the wisdom, who called a dead boy back to life for reasons that were mixed with his own need to be vindicated, who was, in other words, still becoming who he would be. I spent 12 years teaching the arrived Jesus. I used approved textbooks. I followed diocesan guidelines. I answered the questions that the curriculum was designed to answer. And somewhere around year 10, a colleague, a man from Guatemala named Ernesto, who taught Spanish 2 doors down, slid a paperback across the table in the faculty lounge and said, in the particular way of someone who knows they are handing you something that will cost you something, "Have you ever read any Benitez?" I had not. What I found in that paperback, and in the years of following the threads it opened, was not the destruction of what I had believed. It was the expansion of the question. The canonical account did not become false. It became partial, which is a very different thing and a much more demanding thing, because a partial account can't be simply discarded. It has to be held alongside everything it left out. Zeno is part of what it left out, not because the early church was lying, because they were choosing, and their choices were shaped by what they needed Jesus to be in order to anchor the tradition they were building. The text that named Zeno, that recorded his fall and his calling back, that preserved the specific detail of his name being said twice. That text was shaped by what a community needed Jesus to be in order to answer the questions they couldn't stop asking. Questions about the years that the canon left silent. Questions about what divine power actually looks like when it is not yet fully formed. Those questions did not disappear when Irenaeus called the text apocryphal. They kept going. Into Syriac translations, Greek manuscripts, Latin adaptations, the illustrated pages of a Milanese codex in the 1400s. Into the comment sections of videos like this one, where people who were raised in Sunday school write, "Why did no one ever tell me this existed?" The blank page was always full. Someone chose what you would see on it. And if that knowledge sits a little uncomfortably in you right now, if it has moved something that you were not expecting to move, then the portrait is doing what the 2nd century writers intended. They were not trying to make him a monster. They were trying to make him real, the divine that is still becoming, the power that is still learning what it is for. That is not a monster. That is the hardest thing to believe in. Harder than a rival. Harder than perfection. Because it asks you to hold the complexity of a figure who is doing the most extraordinary things imaginable, and still, in a specific moment on a specific afternoon in a specific village, using that power for a reason that is not entirely selfless, and then growing beyond it. That is the portrait the canon chose not to give you. Now I want to know from you. In the comments, and I read them, I read all of them. Which layer of this story landed hardest? Was it the first, that a complete gospel about the childhood of Jesus has existed since the 2nd century and you were never told? Was it the second, the specific detail of why Jesus raised Zeno, not out of love, but to produce a witness who would clear his name? Or was it the third, that the early church named this as non-canonical, and the text survived for 1,200 years in copies and illustrations anyway, because the questions it asked were too persistent to let it die? Tell me, and if this is the kind of history you want to keep finding, the portraits that got set aside, the questions the official account decided not to ask, the years the canon left blank, subscribe. This channel is 12 years of classroom history I was told not to teach. I am still not done teaching it.